Hi, welcome again to Videos from the Ville. I'm Dr. Charles Greenawalt, and this is Canadian Government and Politics. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Canadian Constitution. Many of us think that the Canadian Constitution wouldn't be too dissimilar from the American Constitution, but nothing could be further from the truth, and we need to take a good hard look at the Canadian Constitution and to be able to understand the government, how it functions, and to compare it and contrast it with the government and political system that we're used to in the United States. Well, when we look at a constitution, what's the key idea of constitutional government? The key idea of constitutional government is nothing more than to have an effective restraint on power. So, and this is certainly what was on the minds of Canadian leaders as they forged Canada's Constitution of 1867. The effective restraint of power. What are the elements of a constitution? We find that there are four basic elements of every constitution. One is a preamble. The second would be some type of an organizational chart laying out the organization that's going to be found within this government. Thirdly, we should have a clause that allows us to amend in some way, shape, or form the Constitution. And fourthly, it would be a Bill of Rights telling us what rights the citizens of this nation have. Find that a constitution will always be considered an ingredient in nation building, and the Constitution goes a long way in helping to establish national identity. You find that as we reform a constitution, when we look at reforming a constitution, amending, changing a constitution, you find that we will be, in fact, changing the distribution of power within that country and the distribution of influence within that country. You find that Canada's Constitution is a hybrid between the written Constitution of the United States and the unwritten Constitution of the United Kingdom. What are the elements? And I want you to eventually memorize these. I'd like you to remember the elements of the Canadian Constitution. What are the pieces? Well, one is the Constitution Act of 1867 that I mentioned a moment ago. The Constitution Act of 1867 was formerly called the British North American Act. The British North American Act, the BNA, the British North American Act of 1867. That is one of the foundation stones of the Canadian Constitution. Find that Canada also has a Bill of Rights. That is another element of this Constitution, a Bill of Rights. Number three, we have a War Measures Act, and the War Measures Act is accompanied by the 1988 Emergencies Act. So you have the War Measure Act and the 1988 Emergencies Act. Next, we have the Supreme Court Act, which helps us better understand the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court Act. And then finally, there are two last cornerstones. One is the Constitution Act of 1949. The Constitution Act of 1949. We find that this allowed Canada to amend its own government structure without the consent of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. And lastly, we have the Constitution Act of 1982. The Constitution Act of 1982. Some of the most important conventions of Canadian government find they're not written in the Constitution at all. They're not written in the Constitution at all. Well, the constitutional structure of the government was essentially established by the Constitution Act of 1867, and it was based on the principles of parliamentary sovereignty on one hand and federalism on the other. So parliamentary sovereignty and federalism. We're trying to have them go hand in hand. Well, we find that Canada decided to try to mimic the United States. The United States was the first country to effectively adopt federalism on the national level and be able to maintain it. We find that as we look at federalism, there are a number of different types of federalism. One is called classical federalism. Classical federalism can best be understood, for those of you who have taken public administration, simply as the layer cake model. The layer cake model. This essentially assumes that all government tasks can be delineated very easily, can be drawn out, and given to one level of government or the other. The federal government in Canada controls a number of important things. The federal government in I'm sorry. We were talking about federalism in Canada, and we were talking about one way to look at federalism is classical federalism, and this is using something called the layer cake model. And the layer cake model assumes that we can take the national level of government, the provincial level of government, and then the local level of government, and we can break down all the powers of these various levels of government, and we can separate them, and we can keep them separated. And this is simply the layer cake model is simply saying that each layer of government has its own responsibilities, and we can identify them and lay them out for everyone to look at. You find in the classical federalism model of government, you find that the national government is generally left with the powers of what? With powers of the money supply, the post office, the influx of foreign goods and services and people, so foreign affairs, and to work with the defense needs of the country as well, and national security. Okay. Well, there's different jurisdictions we have to be concerned of when we look at the Constitution. There are two types of jurisdictions. We have a exclusive jurisdiction, and then we have a concurrent jurisdiction. We have exclusive jurisdiction as a situation in which one level of the government or the other has complete control of any designated task. One level of government has the complete responsibility for this. Find another possibility of something called concurrent jurisdiction. Concurrent jurisdiction. We find that both levels of government will have very much of a governing body. So again, exclusive jurisdiction is one level or the other of government completely controls any given task. So again, exclusive jurisdiction, one level of government or the other runs everything that has to do with that area of government. Concurrent jurisdiction is a jurisdiction where both the provincial level, perhaps, and the local level, they both are given tasks to do. So this is concurrent jurisdiction. In concurrent jurisdiction, we may have conflicts between individuals that have different understandings of the provincial law and its interpretation. And this leads us to the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause was adopted by readopted by the Canadian Constitution, and by its Constitution sets forth something called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause. And in the Canadian Constitution, we find that supremacy is given to the Parliament of Canada. It's given to the House of Commons, so that one of the things that we need to bear in mind about the Canadian Constitution at all times is that there is something called the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause ultimately says the country must listen to the House of Parliament, to the Parliament, to the House of Commons in particular. Now, the Constitution also has something else called a Residual Power Clause. The Residual Power Clause is one in which it can deal with present or future government activities. It's not explicitly dealt with as we take a look at allocating our exclusive or our concurrent powers. But the Residual Power Clause is normally given to the level of government that the Constitution writers want to talk to, and they want that government unit to bear the responsibility of whatever happens to this country. So in Canada, this power again is given to the federal jurisdiction. Canada has something that's a little different than we do. It has something called declaratory power. Declaratory power allows the federal government essentially to usurp provincial powers. So the declaratory power allows the federal government's units to usurp. Allows the federal government to usurp. Allows the federal government to usurp provincial powers, and believes that this action is, quote, for the general advantage of Canada or for the advantage of two or more provinces, unquote. So where a government is seeking to use declaratory power, they have to claim that it is for the advantage of one or two areas of federal powers. We find that declaratory power is rarely used, but it is an important bargaining chip in the negotiations that Ottawa has with the provincial governments at some time. Another constitutional quirk of the Canadian Constitution is something called disallowance. Disallowance. This is a procedure whereby the government will declare a provincial government's laws null and void within a year of that passage. So disallowance is a procedure where the federal government may declare a provincial government's laws null and void simply by looking at what that government was up to. Before approval, we find that provincial laws have to be passed by the provincial legislature. They have to be given out by the provincial legislature. So before any laws are approved, we find that these laws have to be passed out by Richard Vogel, excuse me. Before any provincial laws are approved, they have to be passed by the provincial legislature, and they're given royal assent by the lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor, who is acting on behalf of the Queen within the provinces, and all of these rules and regulations are enforced and implemented. They're all enforced and implemented in the provinces. We find all provincial laws are eventually sent to the federal Minister of Justice. And if there's some controversy about the provincial law, you find that if recommended, the provincial law in question may be rejected within 1 year, and a cabinet decision will be issued. The grounds for disallowance may be explained. The grounds for disallowance need not be explained, nor very specific when they're used. Two last things that we want to talk about when we look at the Constitution, how it functions. Another mechanism is called reservation. Reservation. This is a procedure whereby a bill is not given royal assent by the legislature, where the lieutenant governor simply takes the bills until the federal government in council, the cabinet, decides to allow or not allow the bill to become an effective law. So reservation, this is when a bill is not given royal assent by the lieutenant governor until the federal government, settle someone down here. Okay, so reservation, we find that over 70 bills have been reserved since 1867, and 12 were allowed to become law after review. Reservation was last used in 1961 in Saskatchewan, so it's important to remember that when we think of when we think of reservation. It just hasn't been used very many times, and it was last used in 1961. So again, only 70 bills have been reserved since 1967, and 12 were allowed to become law after their review. Well, the last thing that we talk about with the Canadian Constitution, two items, excuse me. One is the item of judicial review. We're familiar with judicial review in America. It's the right of the courts to make judgments on the constitutionality of the executive and legislative branches. We find that in Canada, judicial review is more limited than it is in the United States. In Canada, it's always said judicial review is limited. Find that it is limited, and therefore the Canadian, we have to take in Canada, the judicial system is limited. You find, whereas it's not as limited in the United States. The Canadian Supreme Court rules on which level of government is to exercise what powers. That's what we mean when we talk about the limited nature of judicial review in Canada. So the Canadian Supreme Court rules on what level of government will have what powers and do what things. You find that also use of limited judicial review reflects the principle of parliamentary sovereignty as well. Well, when we look at Canadian constitutional evolution, what do we see? Canada's changed from a very centralized country into a decentralized political system. It's centralized from a very focused and centralized national government into a decentralized political system. Why? Provinces become very disillusioned. Provinces become disheartened with the highly centralized system that was created in 1867. By the late 19th century, the provinces were demanding a whole host of greater powers. So, we want to look at constitutional evolution. When we look at constitutional evolution, to wrap up this segment, we find that Canada has changed from this centralized into a decentralized political system. Why did it change from this centralized to decentralized system? There are really 5 reasons. The provinces become quickly dissatisfied with the highly centralized system. We create a highly centralized system in 1867 when we agree on this new country and on this new constitution. But by the latter part of the 19th century, by the late 1800s, the provinces were demanding more and more, a greater level of powers. And the central government wasn't sure how to deal with these demands. Secondly, you find certain key powers of the federal government become more and more restricted. Judicial decisions from the 1880s through the 1920s, you find that these decisions had to be made by the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council. So how did the interpretation of the Constitution work? How did it work? Well, you had the Canadian Constitution, and it was subject to these decisions from the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council. They can restrict Canada pretty much any time they wish to. So, again, to repeat why Canada's changed from a centralized into a decentralized political system, the provinces became dissatisfied with the highly centralized system created in 1867. Secondly, certain key powers of the federal government became more restricted. Third, judicial decisions from the 1880s to the 1920s, decisions made by the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council, restricts Ottawa's power to go into this area. You find there's also, number 4, a changing nature of society, and also the norms around the nature of society. And fifth and finally is a pattern of province building. Fifth and following is a province of history in the making. So, with that, the changing nature of society and its priorities, and a pattern of province building. Changing nature of society and its priorities, and a pattern of province building. And those are the major reasons. These are the 5 top reasons why Canada's changed from a centralized into a decentralized political system. If you have any questions on this particular presentation, on any others, please send me an email and give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Okay? All right. Well, this is Charlie Greenawalt signing off, and we'll be back with another lecture for you on Canadian government and politics right after this.